literature. Alright guys, so in this short video I'm going to talk you through the context of The Secret River by Kate Grenville. It's a fascinating book with a deep and rich history, so let's get started. I'm going to split this video into 4 parts to make it a little bit easier. First, we're going to talk about life in England during the time that the Thornhills would have been growing up there. Secondly, we're going to talk about British justice and criminality. That's obviously a key theme in the book. Thirdly, we're going to talk about the history of transportation. And finally, we're going to talk about the Aboriginal population of Australia. So let's look at life in England. You can see down the bottom that I've put the dates where this is relevant to our story. William Thornhill was born in 1777 and he died in 1806. So that's the period in England that we're looking at. The basics, well, King George III is King of England. He's known as Mad King George, a really interesting character. We don't have a huge amount of time to go into the specifics of him, but if you're interested, look him up. He's just lost the American War of Independence, so it's a pretty tumultuous time for the monarchy in England. On top of that, England continues to fight a series of wars with Napoleon and France. Devastating for both sides and really huge events happening in Europe at this time. We've also got the effects of the Industrial Revolution. This was sweeping changes which meant you had urbanisation, people moving to cities, and a real change in the way people live their lives. You can see this, particularly in our novel, with the construction of the London docks. The London docks have been constructed in 1805, so right towards the end of William's time in London. But you can see here that trade was booming, partly because of the Industrial Revolution and partly because of this next thing. The British Empire was stretching across the world. All the European powers were scrambling for land across the globe. From Canada to the USA, despite it just being lost, Australia, India, South Africa, parts of the Caribbean and South America. England was trying to stretch its tentacles across the entire globe. So I've given you a very, very brief overview of the big events that were happening in the world at this point. But let's look at the life of the average person living in England, especially the children, as Thornhill was a child throughout much of this time. Children were often forced to work from an incredibly young age. We see this with Thornhill. It could be as young as 5 that children would be working. There was little to no education for poor children. Rich children were educated, but mandatory education didn't come until later. So very few children were educated properly and many of them became illiterate. They often worked in incredibly dangerous conditions. Employers liked children for 2 reasons. One is because they were cheap. The second is because they were small. Children could fit into machines, into the small spaces where adults couldn't fit, to unblock those machines. Very useful for the employer, but incredibly dangerous for the young children. Many were injured or died doing this whilst at work. The hours were incredibly long. Many children could be working up to 16 hours a day with very few breaks and no fresh air or daylight, so incredibly poor conditions. On top of that, when they got home, housing was incredibly crowded, many families living in one room together. They might share an outside toilet and hygiene was very basic. Diseases were rife. There was very little sewage facilities amongst these slums, so disease and bad hygiene caused many, many health problems for families in England at this time. Okay, so if life in Britain was difficult, the British justice system was equally as unforgiving. The 18th century justice system relied on something called the Bloody Code. This was a list of crimes that were punishable by death. There was very little interest in rehabilitation and making people better members of society. It was just about punishment. And by 1800, the amount of crimes for which you could be executed for had risen to well over 200. Execution by hanging was the most common, as we saw with Columbine. On top of this, execution by hanging was often public, as we saw William and Rob watch the execution of Columbine. It could be incredibly traumatic. It was during this time that executions began to be held in private, though, as it was seen again as cruel and unusual to execute people in public. However, that said, during the life of William Thornhill, burning at the stake and being hanged, drawn and quartered were still technically punishments. Being hanged, drawn and quartered was to be hanged not until you were dead, as they would literally tear the insides out of your bodies in front of you and then quarter you and place the different parts of your bodies in different areas to show people that you had been punished justly. Obviously an incredibly brutal crime, and to think this still happened in the day of William Thornhill. Now, if you committed one of the few crimes that wasn't punishable by execution, there were still many fairly brutal methods of justice being inflicted upon you. Criminals convicted of lesser crimes could be fined, they could be branded on the hand by a hot iron, you could be given military duties, you could be shamed in front of the general public in the stocks, you could be flogged, as we see multiple times in the Secret River, given hard labour, made to work for long hours for nothing. Long-term prison sentences were more common towards the end of the century, so we didn't see much of it during the time of William Thornhill. And lastly, the justice that we saw William Thornhill ultimately given, you could be transported, normally between 7 and 14 years. Now, British justice was delivered in two specific places in the Secret River. Newgate Prison was the scene of Thornhill's incarceration. It was where he was locked up. And you can see both of those images on the right are of Newgate Prison. As a prison, it dates back to 1188 and had many, many different redevelopments. Prisons, as we've already said, were seen as a place to hold prisoners until their punishment, though. It wasn't a punishment itself. The Old Bailey was the courtroom of Thornhill's trial. It dates back from the 1500s and is still in London today a really important court. So the punishment you'll be familiar with if you've read The Secret River is transportation, and I'll talk you through the history of this a little bit. James Cook claimed possession of Australia for Britain in 1770, and not long after we saw the first transportation ships arriving. The first ships arrived in Botany Bay in 1788, and there were 11 of those in the first fleet. Britain had tried transportation in different places, including the Americas, but this was relatively unsuccessful. Transportation of criminals really took off in Australia. And we can estimate that there were around 162,000 convicts transported to Australia, so that's a huge amount. Most of those convicts were convicted of petty crimes, minor crimes. There were some serious criminals and there were some political prisoners, but generally the crimes were petty theft. We've seen how many different crimes that you could be executed for, therefore it's a good assumption, and we know from the records, that most of those convicts in Australia that had been transported weren't serious hardened criminals. So let's look at the specifics of what it was like for men. The most common sentence for transportation was 7 years. This could be 14 as well, or sometimes life, but the most common was 7 years. Prisoners could become a free settler or return after this period. Many did stay though. They were given government uniforms to mark them out as government men. These were called slops as they were uncomfortable and probably not particularly flattering. Convicts were given rations of food like salty meat stew. It was a very basic life for them. If you misbehaved whilst in Australia after transportation, you had many different punishments, but you could be expecting to be put in leg irons. Flogging, again, was a likely punishment if you broke the rules. There was also transportation to other punishment settlements, which were considerably worse than those in mainland Australia, such as Van Diemen's Land. Really difficult, hard places to live where many people died. Tickets of leave were given to men, allowing them to become free settlers. Typically after a period of time, restrictions were put in place later, but at the start it was any period of time where you behaved yourself, you could be given a ticket of leave, and you can see one on the right there. This is what Thornhill got after his first year. They allowed freedoms, but you were not allowed to board ships or carry firearms until you had completed your sentence.